I want to first thank Mark for that really kind introduction, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. This is my very first Learning Impact Leadership Institute, and somehow I found myself up here. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm even more excited to be able to talk to you about this topic, which maybe many of you haven't thought about before, the data gap between libraries and learning. So that's what I want to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so. But I want to start off, because we've been in this room for a very long time, although it's been riveting. We've been in here for a really long time. I wanted to start off with a question to get you focused, to bring your prior knowledge to the fore, have your past experience inform your present, and so on. So I have a question for you. It's extremely difficult. It's not on the order of Vince's BFNs, but it's close. I want to ask you, how many of you remember this segment from Sesame Street? How many of you remember this? Were you a child in the 70s or 80s, or had a child in the 70s or 80s? Raise your hand if you remember this. Right, oh, that's great, that's great. We all have a common experience. So the segment, for those of you who didn't raise your hand on Sesame Street, was called Which One of These Is Not Like the Others? And the song, which I will not sing, is Which One of These Is Not Like the Others? Which One of These Just Doesn't Belong? And the point of this segment was to put several items on the screen, and children were supposed to figure out which one is not like the others, which means they had to figure out what the commonality was with the other things that led the one thing to be different, right? So if you haven't had this in your background, or if you just want to have a throwback moment, let's walk through one of these. In the top left, in the green quadrants, we see a hammer, pliers, a saw, and a shoe. Quick quiz. Which one of these is not like the others? Shoe, well done. So I thought somebody'd say pliers for sure. Okay, so shoe, your brain very quickly figured out that the hammer, the pliers, and the saw are all tools, great. And a shoe is not usually a tool, strictly defined. So that was easy, and I would like to talk about the one with the possessed cow in the corner, and I didn't realize flamingos could fly, and what's up with the lady dressed as a bee, but I'm going to move to something a little more closely related to our topic this week at our conference. So I want to ask you to take that skill and apply it to the next slide. On this slide, there are a number of categories of data on the periphery of the screen. So learning management system data, IPASS data, SIS data, and so on. I want you to look at those and try to figure out which one of these is not like the others. Library data, good. And the commonality is really big, is in big font, right? Capital letters in the center of the screen. The commonality of the other types of data is that we're either currently integrating them at the institutional level into learning analytics, or we want to real bad and are working on it. But library data is the thing that is not like the others, though I would argue that it absolutely belongs. Okay? So I want to talk about that a little bit. I feel almost silly sometimes taking the position of library data should be involved, at the institutional level, and the whole focus of what we know about students, student success, their behaviors, which behaviors and interactions and experiences lead to success or away from success. Because the library is supposed to be the heart of the university, right? And at the K-12 level, usually the library is an interdisciplinary, safe space that all comers are welcome to in our schools. So it feels silly to say, the libraries are really about student learning, but of course they are. And yet, learning data, or library data, is not included with other kinds of learning data in this work. Pioneering efforts that you all are spending all of your time with, or much of your time with, tend to, I wouldn't say exclude, I think just omit library data. I don't think it's intentional. I think it just sort of happened. And that's where we're at now. But I think that when we omit library data from our learning analytics and our institutional learning picture, I feel like we're leaving a big gap, we're leaving a big hole, right? Kind of like this. Supposedly this is a real hole in the UK, or it could have been a hoax site that I just didn't evaluate carefully enough. But in any case, even if you don't wake up thinking about libraries and go to sleep thinking about libraries like I do, I would think that you would want to fill this hole. I listed on the screen some of the elements that we need to have quality data, right? Credibility, accuracy, it needs to be unbiased, timely, and so on. But the one I made real big was completeness, because I wanted to make the point that there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, right? And With what will we fill it? Library data. So there's a hole in our institutional pictures when we don't include library data. And the view from out here is like, there's a hole. But if you're a librarian, you're down at the bottom of the hole saying, you know what, we actually do make an impact. In academia, academic librarians have put together a corpus of research over the last decade or so, indicating the impact of using library resources on things like GPA. It moves the needle on GPA, on other achievement markers, on retention. If you want to look at an example of that, the University of Minnesota has a great body of work on that, as do others. Also, we know that library interactions with librarians, students and librarians, in the form of reference questions being answered, and library instruction sessions also help achieve learning outcomes and influence persistence, improve retention, particularly amongst some of the high priority, high need groups that lots of institutions are concerned about. At the school library level, we've got decades of research indicating that libraries with librarians make a difference in terms of student achievement. So at the bottom of the hole, it sounds a little bit like shouting, we're here, we make a difference. But in any case, whether you're at the outside in the grassy area looking down like, that might be a problem, or if you're at the bottom of the hole feeling a little bit like, what about me? Either way, I think we can agree there's a hole. Okay, so we need to figure out how we might consider fixing it, or what we might need to address to fix it. Oh, look at that, I fixed it. But rather than just covering it up, I think there's really two areas that we really need to think about addressing in order to help fill that hole. So they're probably the same ones that you have in your own work that you're doing: culture and technology. So what I'm about to say in the next couple minutes, 8 minutes apparently, they've got a timer clock down here, is a few things about culture and technology and what we need to do about those things. But I want to acknowledge that the work that I'm sort of paraphrasing isn't just mine. I've been lucky enough to spearhead 2 federally funded grants funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services around this issue. The first one, Library Integration and Institutional Learning Analytics, is wrapping up. The white paper is in the EDUCAUSE library, and I tweeted out the link if anyone's following the hashtag today, so it's there, or I can just give you my copy in my bag. And Connecting Libraries and Learning Analytics for Student Success has just kicked off and is starting off. So there are a lot of people behind the kinds of things that I'm going to say today, and I also want to acknowledge that we're doing a panel tomorrow on the Lila project, the first of the 2. Okay, so let's talk about culture. So from an institutional perspective, there's lots of things, but there's 2 main things I wanted to mention. First of all, I often find myself talking to people who are doing learning analytics work or trying to combine kinds of data, maybe not fully mature learning analytics projects, but trying to combine data to understand student success. And when I ask them, did you decide to include any library data in that picture or the model, they say, no, I only wanted to include things that make a difference for student learning. You laugh, but it happens all the time, right? It happens to me frequently, even amongst people that really should know better. So I think we need to do some work on an overall awareness of the impact of libraries on learning, so that's more of an obvious statement than a startling one when I say that there's a difference. And I think, as is true in all of our analytics and even assessment work, we need to be clear at institutional level that if we're going to take this data, which librarians, many of them, aren't totally sure about handing over, or in some cases would probably resist for privacy reasons, that we're going to use that information to break down systematic, structural, policy, procedural, and other kinds of hurdles for students to clear them out of the way, right? Not just to tell a student, you're at risk, what can we do for you, but to clear out the things that are causing those risks as much as we can. So the decision-making and action-taking are really important. From a library culture, so within the library, there's 2 things that you need to know are going on. One, librarians have a past practice, deeply entrenched in library culture, of not collecting, not maintaining, and actively destroying data that links library users and their library use. And that is about privacy. That is about not wanting to have information that then can be revealed or breached or end up in the hands of bad actors, right? So that's really important. And then there's also, so that's part of the ethical concerns as well. And then there's also another ethical concern. Also baked into library culture is the desire to serve and help and support student learning in this case, right, specifically. So in some cases, we have conversations in library land about these two seemingly conflicting ideas, questioning whether or not it's ethical to collect, store, and use data at all, because bad things, right? And on the other hand, a question around whether or not it's ethical not to act on data that we have. If we can help students and we have data or could easily get it, how can we not? And I think there's a false dichotomy going on there. I think there are ways, and I think people in this room understand that, and I think that the conversation across higher ed needs to happen, that there are ways to mitigate the risks and realize the benefits. And so, just like anything else, it's not binary. It's not yes, no. There's a continuum here in which we need to find a comfortable place, particularly with librarians, because they do believe that they want to help students, and they do believe that they want to maintain privacy and trying to find ways to do both through security, policy, governance, trying not to keep data that could be revealing but isn't helpful, being transparent with users and educating students on how we're using their data. From a technology perspective, remember culture and technology, we need to do an inventory of potential data contributions from the library. So what does the library have to offer? Some of it is probably useful to understanding student learning and success. Some of it might not be at all. So doing an audit and thinking about those relationships and what might be reasonably useful. Figuring out how to deal, like as many of us are, with the ecosystem that exists within libraries of all the vendor relationships, all the siloed systems, and so on. I'm not talking to you about anything you're not aware of already. And the need for interoperability, which is what brought me to Rob and Mark and Anthony White. So I think that's how I ended up here. Seems like a good explanation. So in the Lila work, this is part of a larger table. We started to do that audit and thinking about what kinds of interactions do students have with libraries, and what kind of data does that generate, and where are the sources for that data? What sources would emit that data? So this is only part of it. If you're on Twitter, you can scroll to page 34. But looking at reference interaction, instructional interaction, attendance at exhibits or events, collections usage, facilities, technology usage in the library, and so on. And then the last column, I know it's not super readable, but are some of the source systems that might be implicated. We also spent a lot of time talking about what library interactions might be useful in understanding student-library interactions, but also how those lead to or away from success. And we've talked a lot about developing maybe 1 or 2 caliper profiles that would help with this, which I also think could be helpful to others, but possibly a participation profile, so student participated in, for libraries, reference instruction or an event. But I could see how that would be useful in other situations. And then you could decorate that triple with other attributes. Or attended, because we didn't want to say was at a library space. We know that library spaces make a big difference, but we're trying to figure out how to articulate that. Library use, like checking something out or accessing something. But again, we get into the weeds pretty quickly about how much do we need to know to answer important questions and how much do we not want to know. So for example, with the access idea, student access like an article. Do we need to know that they accessed an article? Because that's where some of the studies are now. We know, Minnesota I mentioned, they know that there's e-resource access, but nothing more than that. Do we need to know what database? Do we need to know what journal? Do we need to know what specific article? If it's related to a course, so that's context, right? If it's related to a course and they've linked through from a reading list, maybe that's not so private. If it's a personal curiosity or something that they're thinking about that might have, potentially relationships to health or identity or something else, maybe we don't want to know. Maybe that's going too far. So having those conversations about how much do we build into a profile, we don't want to cut off our options, but we also don't want to open the door to something we're not ethically ready for, right, or prepared to deal with. So it's complicated. Get in the weeds pretty quick with this stuff in the conversations, but I think they're important conversations to have, even though they're difficult conversations to have. So there was 2 things I wanted you to come away from this 15 minutes with. One was an idea, and one was an action item. The first is just the main idea, that there is a hole where library data should be in the full institutional picture of student learning and success. There's a hole there. Libraries have data, librarians have data skills, and they sure as heck care about student learning to a huge degree, right? So they should be part of the conversation. that we should be able to fill in that hole in some way. And then the to-do item I'm going to ask you to commit to is to expect libraries to be present in your work. Expect that, instead of assuming that maybe they're off doing something else, right? Or not even giving it any thought to begin with. Expect them to be there. So if you work at an institution, have a conversation with a librarian. Or if you work at an organization that works with many institutions, start including librarians in those conversations. Ask them, what data do they have? What data could they get? And what could they contribute in terms of expertise and opinions and values and ethics and all of the rest? Okay, thank you for listening. You guys paid good attention. I could see you despite the bright lights. Thank you for that. I hope that some of you will come up and talk to me about this throughout the rest of the week. Thanks a lot.